Hello again. So since my last video, there have been a few more things put out about Mythic Plus, raids, and the like. Even that interview that I featured in my last video, that article itself was updated with several more answers and details that weren't in it when I recorded the first video, so I thought it merited a new one discussing all the new points. So I'm gonna just dive right into it. Here we go. The first one is that Season 1 Mythic Plus dungeon tuning is already being done after the first round of testing. And some of the big changes here are actually nerfs that are pretty good ones, but also anti-cheese have been a lot of been fixed too, because they're paying attention to the testing. They see when players are cheesing shit and fix it. For example, averting shill now ignores line of sight. They know what you were doing. And fixes like this, not casting pets or guardians, that's good. The mechanics already worked. But there's some interesting ones down here I wanted to point out. Missed Veil Bite no longer has a cast time. This seems like an odd strange, right? Or an odd change, right? But you look at the spell. This is a tank bleed. What do players often do with tank bleeds? They kite them. Think of Legacy of Tyr, the Ultiman dungeon. The most common strat for those mobs that are stacking bleed in the tanks is to kite them, because when you do, it keeps interrupting their cast repeatedly. Well, you can't interrupt the cast if there is no cast time, can you? Can you still outrange the mob? Probably. But the point is, you can't joust with them. Like, the strategy in Legacy of Tyr was to joust. Like, you weren't perpetually kiting forever. You were basically like, oop, stutter step, oop, stutter step, oop, stutter step, working your way back just enough to screw with the mob's cast time that they couldn't get the actual cast off. And this seems like a preemptive measure, going, yeah, we know what you're doing. We're watching you. So you look at it and think about it in that perspective, now it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, on why they killed the cast time on a tank bleed. This one's another interesting one. No longer has a cast time, was a 2-second cast. And as a modder that recently looked at this spell, I know why they did that too. It's because you could preemptively see the target during the cast and stop the application of the debuff altogether. Or you could just pre-position and just basically you had advanced warning you were the target of the spell before it hits you, and now it's instant cast. Now you can't be like, oh, it's casting on me, AMS, bubble, ice block. Now you can't preemptively position because you got an early warning from DBM or Bigwigs, because we both had an early warning for this spell. I checked. And yeah, no cast time. Now they want this debuff to hit the player. And there are some other ignore line of sight changes in here. This one now ignores line of sight. Again, that's one of the ones that you're going to see often. There's probably some they missed, and they're going to find them. Quasi's going to have a video, about every mechanic. Make this mechanic giga easy. You know what I'm talking about. And then you're going to see changes like this the week after. I don't know if this means they're going to be quicker to make changes like this, but it's interesting to see that they're already making them after only a single round of Mythic Plus testing in the beta. They're already fixing tons of spells that were either overtuned, undertuned, or easily exploitable. So that's my talk about Mythic Plus. Now, in my previous video, I talked about private auras and how there haven't been a lot of them. Like, they've been very conservative with them. I noticed this myself. I pointed out this observation. Well, the interview actually explained that. They actually explained, I'm not going to read this aloud because I will fuck it up. I know I will fuck it up. So I'm just going to TLDR it. They basically said they don't want to go as deep into private auras as they did last year because they don't want the solution to be worse than the disease. They don't want to create situations where the answer is make annoying as hell macros for the abilities and then have to press the macro at the right time to circumvent the private aura. So they're evaluating spells on a case-by-case basis and going, does the private aura fix the problem? No, then it doesn't make sense to add it because it's just going to make it worse, not better. So most of the spells they're flagging, and I had noticed it, are spells that aren't annoying enough to need to macro. It's basically like the private auras on a Bolacross, where the Mythic soaks are private auras, but nobody needed a macro to solve that mechanic. It was just like, well, whatever, we'll handle it without weak auras solving it for us. And that's it. So basically, middling mechanics that aren't hard enough to go, hey, we need an add-on to solve this for us, and we're going to make it happen no matter how annoying or convoluted it's going to be. We're going to make it happen. So basically, most of these spells that are flagged, they're not hard enough mechanics to merit the busy work to macro and do all that stuff with. They're just things that they want to stop the automation just enough that at least some mechanics won't be automatically assigned by a boss mod going, you go left, you go right, you go center. That's how the soaks are going to work automatically. You know, most of those debuffs like that, players are just going to verbalize it, and that's what they want. So yeah, that's my update on private auras and why they've been conservative. Because at this point last tier, there were like 47 private auras already. There's only 20 here. So there's more than half the private auras, and that's including the fact that some of these are in dungeons. And there were no dungeon private auras last tier, so last tier had like 47 private auras or whatever in just the raid. Now, mind you, I'm pulling that number out of my ass. It's not, I don't know if it's exactly 47, but I know it's up there. A lot more than this. Another thing I wanted to note is this week, this boss has not been tested yet on Heroic or Mythic, but they just massively buffed the second to last boss on Mythic difficulty. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit because it's interesting, because the interview does specifically talk about how they felt Tindral probably had too high of a difficulty curve, and that maybe it shouldn't have been that hard, and maybe the raid progression shouldn't have been so much of a flatline, brick wall type deal with the last two bosses, or even three bosses if you consider Smolderon, but he wasn't quite nearly the barrier that Tindral and Farak were. But does this make the fight a Tindral? No. But I do think that before they made these changes, because the Mythic mechanics were already in, they've been in for a few weeks. They just decided this week the Mythic mechanics weren't hard enough and made them harder. The original Mythic mechanics were basically like half the raid got Paranoia and half the raid got Rage. And if they came in contact with or no, it wasn't even the contacting. It was basically like people who had Rage were hostile against Paranoia, and people who had Paranoia were hostile against Rage. It was basically a forced raid split on the pole, where you had to keep the bosses split and keep the raids separated, so you weren't accidentally killing each other. Now they're making it so it's not just an easy as amalgamation, where you just, okay, simple, split the raid up, call it a day. No, they want you to actually be forced to interact with the other group, not just avoid them. Because now, periodically, you're going to be dropping sparks. I'm going to call it turds. Basically, when you have the debuffs, everyone's going to be pooping turds that people with the same debuff can't pick up. Only people with the other debuff can pick it up. So what's going to happen now is now you can have some kind of carousel going to where the whole raid is moving in maybe a circle so that they can pick up the other group's turds. But in addition to that, each person can only pick up the 2 turds per 12 seconds, because if you pick up a third one, you get marked for death, which is basically you take 150 million damage per second forever, and it persists through death. Like, if you get this debuff, you can't even be battle resed. You're just, well, you're marked for death. You're out of the fight. So it's going to be a situation to where you're going to be moving constantly, policing other people's turds, and doing so in a way to where everyone is only picking up to 2 per 12 seconds. So it's going to be constant moving, constant coordination. And mind you, this is a boss too that if you think of Council in Emirdrasil, to where you have to use Ursak to interrupt the Vines cast from other mob, this boss has several mechanics like that. Not just 1 or 2, but like several. Where you have to, Reckless Charge has to be used to interrupt one of this boss's mechanics. Then you have to use the debuff Stinging Swarm to interrupt another boss's mechanic. And that's, again, you're going to have players constantly crossing back and forth or aiming bosses at each other that you otherwise want to actually keep separated. So Mythic is going to be a lot of moving parts. And I imagine it's going to be very sequenced. If you consider Tindral again, like where it's going to be a dance where you memorize the dance, and repetition is going to be the key to mastering that dance. So basically, I think the second boss with these changes got a sizable buff, and it's going to be interesting on Mythic. It's going to be one of those cases again where the race to world first isn't just about the end boss, it's going to be about the end 2 bosses, I suspect. Like the third to last boss, even on Mythic, I don't see that being a huge barrier. Unless it's just... I see it being a DPS barrier. I feel like it's going to be like Smolderon in similarity, that the check on this boss is going to be getting the boss to 0% before the wipe mechanic, which is the third Starless Night. On the third Starless Night is basically the Soften Rage, where she just covers the whole room repeatedly. It's basically exactly like Smolderon. Like, I almost think it was on purpose that they intentionally made the design similar. So we're looking at a DPS check, a dance check, and mechanic overload check. So it's going to be interesting to see this race to world first be based pretty much on these 3 bosses again, but mainly the last 2. That's my prediction. That's what I want to talk about with the raids. Next, I want to talk about what they talked about in visual clarity. Visual clarity, they talked about several points. And it's funny because Blizzard finally acknowledges the meme. You know, the red on red on red, the blue on blue on blued meme. Where they're like, yes, we get it. It's hard to see. And we've over-focused on trying to make theme or lore and theme accurate. But didn't quite consider what that meant for gameplay, and now they're going to try to find a middle ground on that. They still want that theme to exist, so it's not going to be like purple mechanics on a fire boss. They're going to be like, no, this boss is a fire boss. He should be using orangest mechanics, and the room is probably going to be pretty orange, but... And there was some good examples in Mythic too, like where they actually managed to capture the theme, but still had enough distinction between the spells. So I think they're kind of finding that middle ground, at least in raids. But I do feel like they didn't answer the question about Mythic Plus at all. Or spell noise. They kind of talked about spell noise, and I'm going to get to that in a second, but... At least they're acknowledging red on red on red. But there's a way to go. Another thing they talked about is the dust people were using. Like making bosses transparent, like Razageth, because you couldn't see mechanics under her wings. And their answer, I'm just going to say it, it was a really bad answer, because their idea for why they nerfed that was because they didn't want something one player can do to disrupt another player's gameplay. But I can't think of a single player that would say being able to see what was under the boss was disruptive. Like, it wasn't adding visual noise to another player's screen or anything like that. If anything, just casting your AoEs is disruptive to other players if you use that logic. But anyways, they nerfed being able to make bosses transparent. And then their answer to it is, oh, but we added new technology that made your player easier to see. That was never the problem to why people using the dust. There was never an issue seeing your player. Everybody knows where their player is. Their player is perpetually in the dead center of the screen. I mean, yes, the camera collision thing they added is a good change. I'm not saying it's not. But they basically answered a question with an answer for the wrong question. Like, they weren't talking about the camera or being able to see your player. The dust question was about being able to see stuff that's under a giant-ass boss whose model is in your face. And their answer just... it didn't matter. The camera thing is amazing tech. I hope they go with it, and I hope they eventually find a way to make walls transparent, because let me tell you, the day that that prison comes back in Mythic Plus will be hell for me. I hate that place. Not because the mechanics are bad, but because the camera was bad. And they need to improve that tech as well. But they also need to acknowledge the fact that if you have this giant boss wing on your screen, and there's swirlies under it you can't see, that's a problem. And that players were addressing that problem for a reason, and to nerf that without even acknowledging the problem is an issue. Because their answer to that question was a failure of acknowledgement. I'm gonna even, let's see, dust. Yeah, it's right here. They didn't acknowledge, nowhere in this did they acknowledge the problem. Instead, they talked about a completely different problem that they had an answer for. It was a complete redirect, and it completely missed the point. Now I'm going to talk about another thing that's very important. They talked about visual noise. Any plans to add visual filters, allowing you to turn off friendly spells. The TLDR of it was, yes, they are looking into it, and they're doing it in a way that I suggested they do 4 years ago. I'm gonna let you in a little secret. In December of 2020, I noticed this setting in the game. Spell density. Now, you look at it and it's like, this setting alone, in theory, should solve that problem that players have. You should just be able to set it to, I only want to see essential spells, or I only see some spells. And you have a dynamic option here that goes, reduce spell clutter based on performance. This setting has existed since this tech has existed since Legion, and then the setting was refined a little bit after. And I talked to a dev in 2020, I'm like, you know, when I set this, I asked, it's like, I set this to essential, but it's not really doing anything. I still see everything. And the answer I got was a pretty honest answer. They basically said, yeah, that tech exists, but no one uses it. But that was the straight answer that I got, is that the setting is not magic. It doesn't know what spells are essential or semi-essential, etc., unless the designers actually go in and flag each spell as essential or non-essential, etc. And I think there's a lot of designers, and I'm not saying malintent either, he says it's more of an ignorance thing. It's like, well, people don't know this tech exists, or they forgot it exists because it's woefully underused. And I noticed when he answered this today, not today, but in this interview, he specifically says, we actually have a lot of really cool tools when it comes to performance and making sure your performance doesn't take too much of a hit. So potentially leveraging some of that on a more intentional design perspective, and not just when performance starts to take a hit, are some areas are looking to improve. He's specifically talking about this. You can see it right here. This is the design. This is what he's talking about. The setting that's designed to improve performance by reducing clutter. And this is the lead encounter designer going, this tech exists, and we recognize this tech exists. We need to actually use it. Because I brought this up, like I said, I brought this up to someone in December of 2020, 4 years ago, that this tech exists, and it's not being utilized. And, well, better late than never, right? I'm hoping they utilize it better, but there is some design philosophy conflicts, too, with regard to what's essential and what isn't. Like, one of the biggest perpetrators for visual noise is AoE. And AoE spells, they're not misflagged. In fact, many of them are actually flagged as essential on purpose. And the reason why is because there's a design philosophy that says the tank should be able to see where players are casting so they don't inadvertently move mobs out of AoE. And stuff like that. So, in essence, a lot of visual noise is intentionally caused because they have a philosophy that you should be able to see where your fellow players' spells are. And in a sense, I can kind of see where they're going. But I think they're also underestimating player intelligence in this regard. If you have a pack of mobs, and you know players are AoEing them, like I'm a tank main. I've been a tank main the entire time I played WoW, which is well over 15 years. If I know players are AoEing mobs, I don't need to see a ridiculous amount of visual noise to tell me that they're AoEing mobs. I know they're AoEing mobs. It's the AoE phase of the fight. We have a bunch of ads, I group them up, and I stop moving, and they AoE. I'm not gonna, in my tank brain, I'm not going, gee, I'm gonna kite the mobs around the room and keep moving them so they can't AoE them. No, that'd be stupid. I'd be a bad tank if I'm moving mobs constantly. When you're doing a Mythic Plus, the number one thing in Mythic Plus is move as little as possible. Group everything up, stop moving, AoE, move to next pack. So in an essence, we don't need all that visual noise to do this, to do our job as a tank. They can reduce that visual clutter, and tanks will figure it out. We're smart. We're smart. We know what we're doing, you know, most of us. And it doesn't need to be noisy. I think they need to go in and actually flag a lot of these spells less aggressively using the essential variable. Essential to me is a frost trap. It's being able to know that's where the mobs will be slowed. That's where I need to kite the mobs. You know, that's essential. A million consecrates and blizzards and flame strikes, that's not essential. The only thing I need to see for that is my own spell. In fact, I want to use one of my own spells as an example. One of the best spells right now that actually get the design philosophy perfectly is Ravager. I'm going to drop a Ravager right here. See this spell? Only the warrior that casts this sees these red swirlies. That's it. If another warrior drops Ravager, there are no swirlies. All you can see is the weapon spinning around very subtly. It's extremely subtle. It's not noisy. It's not disruptive. If there are 10 warriors in the rage and we all drop a Ravager at the same time, you don't see 10 giga swirlies on your screen. You see only your own. That is the way spells should be. All spells. Like, yes, it's okay to see some of it. Like, if someone drops a flame strike, you can maybe see like a small circle. But like, as it stands now, we're seeing way too much. Consecrate is a big offender. Let me tell you something about Mythic Plus. There is a ridiculous amount of consecrates in the Flame Dungeon that are deadly. You know what I'm going to be doing? When I have a paladin in my group that drops consecrate, I'm going to be moving mobs out of it. Because I'm going to see that, and my immediate gut reaction is danger. Because I can't tell that consecrate from the enemy's consecrate. And that's a problem. It's kind of ironic, really, that the reason many spells are flagged for the tank so that they don't move out of spells is going to cause me to move out of spells. How's that for a twist? In reality, the reason they have them flagged as visible, as essential, is going to be the reason we move out of them. So, yeah. This is a great acknowledgement, but I hope they understand, too, that when they're flagging spells, to recognize that they need to reevaluate internally what's essential, what's not. Because they start using this tech for reducing visual clutter, then it relies heavily on each designer on the class team, on the encounter team, to go through these spells and flag them all appropriately, and even ask for player feedback, even like open dialogue that goes, okay, players, what do you need to see? What don't you need to see? And get down to a point to where if I go like this and set it to essential, essential doesn't mean 90% of the spells are still visible. It means my spells are visible. It means frost traps and boss mechanics I need to avoid are visible. It does not mean every Paladin Consecrate, every Blizzard, every Flame Strike under the sun still being on the screen because my intelligence is being belittled. You know, players have been playing this game for a long time. They don't need their handheld as much as Blizzard thinks they do when it comes to visuals. They just need to see what matters to them, and communication will solve the rest. You know, if the tank moves out of a spell, that's a dialogue between the tank and the other player. Not for Blizzard to try to solve it with visual clutter. And that's all I'm really going to say on that issue. I've ranted on it a long time, and this video's already getting longer than I thought it would be. And I'm sure I'll have more points to talk about. You know, beta is ever evolving and ever changing. So I'm sure there'll be a new video soon discussing more changes and interviews and hot fixes and tuning. And I'll see you in the next one.